What's the problem with Patriot? Everyone is asking. Puns aside, in the last day of racing, American Magic was seemingly exposed for a lack of cyclor power, frustrating the trimmers with a lack of adjustment on their sails. But digging deeper into the comms coming off the boats and looking at everything we know about the American Magic cyclor setup, is this really the case? First of all, we've got to talk about the American Magic cyclor setup. Probably the big reason why we're talking about this so much is because it is so different to everyone else's. If you don't already know, American Magic have gone for recumbent cyclors. It's allowed within the cup rule, and it places their power team lying down on their backs, pumping the pedals. This allows them to reduce the freeboard of their yacht, reduce its frontal area, and hopefully reduce the aerodynamic drag of their platform, allowing them to reach higher speeds. Why then did the other teams not go for recumbents if it's a lower frontal area? Well, for power output, the theory is that upright cyclists can be about 10% more efficient. But the caveat here is the studies that predict that are based mostly on cyclists who normally cycle upright and aren't adapted to the recumbent position. Add on to that, a lot of these athletes aren't coming from an upright cycling background, they're coming from a rowing background where they put out power predominantly with their legs in a recumbent position. I'm going to go through some of the clips of the data, listening to the comms coming off the boat to try and discern exactly what's being said and exactly what were the issues being discussed by the sailors, and see if that can give us a hint as to what the real problems were on Patriot. Before we get into that, I just want to recommend a video to you, probably the most watched video from a YouTube on all this America's Cup, and I'm disturbed it's not myself, but actually a cycling channel, GCN, Global Cycling Network. I've been a subscriber to them for a long time, being a keen cyclist, so it was really interesting to see their perspective on this cyclor setup. There's some interesting little takeaways from that video. First of all, we see their indoor setup. I've got these recumbent, and you can see all of them have like slightly different hand grips, got a screen in front, and they've got some sort of erg. And now GCN did do their best to blur out as much of this setup as possible. See, I've gone through all this with a fine-tooth comb to find the glimmers through the blurring, but you can see their setups. They've made these kind of stainless ergs, and the ergs you've actually got it plugged into seem to be a Wahoo kicker, and they seem to still have the flywheels on, which I was a bit surprised at, because I mean, I've made a video on this before, but one of the big differences between normal cycling on a road and what these athletes are doing on the boat is the lack of inertia when pumping oil. So they're feeling resistant all the way around the pedal stroke, no matter if they back off or not. So I might have expected them for their training to remove the flywheels from their ergs, but I can't find any evidence of that. So just zooming in on them, looks like this is a setup here. You can see the steel system, and it goes to a Wahoo kicker wheel. Looks like they still got the ergs there. Did notice in the background of this shot, if we look in this corner, is these chain rings, which is something else I would be looking for. I've said they've got no flywheel on these boats, so what I would look to do is actually make all the drivetrain components as heavy, not as heavy as possible, but kind of as strong as possible and as byproduct heavy as possible. So I wouldn't be looking to make anything really out of carbon fibre. I would have basically big dinner plate chain rings, not out of aluminium, but out of solid stainless steel, quite thick, chunky, so there's no deflection. That is what I'd use, and I'd use the biggest chain ring as possible because, well, firstly, it's more efficient the less you're kind of bending that chain around the chain ring, And secondly, because the bigger you make it, the heavier it is, so you get that subtle flywheel effect. So actually spotting these chain rings in the workshop behind, possibly these are chain rings that go on the boat, big solid pieces of steel. Another takeaway I took from the GCN video, which again recommend you go and see, was when he gets in the boat and he describes the setup that's there, and he describes one huge chain ring, SRAM red cranks, but then there's this discussion about it being fixed. Oh, it's a fixie, I can't freewheel. And that to me indicates that they may be running a tandem setup, because, well, why would you need to freewheel if you just had a single unit pumping oil? Because surely when you stop turning your legs, it's not like a bike where you need a freewheel to carry on moving forward. If you stop your legs, they all just kind of stop. So that was an odd one to hear. So I think both of them are in tandem, either linked through the chain drives. Therefore, there's no freewheel. So if you stop pedaling, the person behind you is still pedaling that you're linked with, and obviously them moving the pedals would then kind of interfere with you kind of trying to stop. The final thing to say about their cyclor setup, and we spoke about it a lot already, but they are under cover. So they've got these cyclor covers, which are quite good at, well, supposedly reducing the amount of airflow that comes down into those cyclor cockpits to reduce the drag from any kind of turbulence kind of bowling over the edges. I looked into this because I thought, well, maybe that is causing some power issues with them. If they're reducing the airflow into those cyclor cockpits, maybe that's reducing the cooling. And inclusion in quite a few situations, they are better off in the shade. They'll cool better in the shade with no breeze running over them than they would in direct sunlight, but with quite a lot of airflow in the cockpit. So that was quite interesting. So let's listen to the comms on the boat, shall we?
35 nautical miles.
Oh, and a big touchdown, unfortunately, by the Americans exiting that jibe. Are they running out of oil?
The issue seems to have been that Cunningham's still on. Now, maybe they had Cunningham on downwind, which seems odd. You wouldn't think they would have Max coming on downwind. And maybe they were kind of worried about letting the Cunningham off, because then they'd have to pull it back on, and that takes power. This seems maybe more like a trimming error than a cyclor power error.
To all just really do a good job in their own job.
Racing.
That's Tom saying, let's all do a good job in our own job here. I mean, I don't know. That would annoy me as a sailor if the helm's just being like, everyone just do your job well. I was like, well, obvious. Like, what do you think I'm trying to do?
Let's try to pick some shifts. It's pointless just throwing tacks at him when he's gaining. 60.
So Tom says, let's try and pick some shifts. It's pointless throwing tacks at him when we're losing. So I think this is the only kind of more obvious kind of hint at them being some sort of oil issue, although it's obviously directly referencing an issue in tacks. They're basically losing in tacks. They don't want to engage in another tacking duel. So here we've got against Ineos. This is quite an interesting one.
It's a tough manoeuvre for us.
It's a tough manoeuvre for us, says Slingsby. So this is a double jibe into the leeward mark. But Ineos do pull off that double manoeuvre. They are further out from the leeward mark, so it's a bit easier for them. They've got a bit more time to build between the two jibes. But again, on this, I think there is a glimmer that this might be an oil problem for Magic if they don't want to do the double jibe, because the right mark is favoured. There's then quite an interchange up this beat, and I think here there are more examples of Magic struggling with the tacks and maybe with the oil. So we've just got to concentrate on our tacks here, says Tom Slingsby. I'm really worried about staying high on the exits. Big press on the exits, I think Michael Menninger says. And the big press, what they mean by press is like a bear off to build speed, a press down away from the wind. And you do see this in some of the Magic tacks, looking at the data, but the big dip in their VMG compared to Switzerland and where they drop away in the distance gained is on the exit of the tack where their VMG goes down. And if you look at boat speed, yeah, they have lost a bit of boat speed compared to the average for Switzerland, but it's also the angle. So you can see they come away to 60 degrees true wind angle on the exit of the tack to do their build. That may be because they don't have the power to release their Cunningham and the main sheet to make the sail deeper on the exit of the tacks, which is what you would prefer to do, because they're worried that if they do that, they'll have to then pull those controls back on. That takes too much energy, which they're running out of. So instead, to compensate, they are doing bigger presses on the exit of the tacks, so bearing further way out the wind, sailing more across the wind rather than into it, which gives you a little power boost and makes it easier to kind of build that speed on the exit, but isn't as good for the VMG, but is kind of like a compensation for not being able to power up and then depower the sails as you then accelerate away from the tack. Yeah, you let me know, what do you think? Tough day for Magic. In the end, they won one, lost one, so on paper it wasn't too bad, but you kind of felt like the mood on the boat wasn't that positive, and that they were starting to realise a limitation with the boat they've got. Again, all these compromises are nuances, and it doesn't mean it's a weakness in all conditions or in all scenarios. And in other areas, they've made gains with their lower freeboard and lower aerodynamic drag. So it's more about where the trade-off is and how other teams can exploit the trade-offs their opponents have made. Really like picking your category in top trumps. Anyway, that's it. All from me. Take care. See you around.